When I'm recording, I nearly always do it sat on this settee with the wall behind me. I'm sat in the conservatory, but a wonderfully large conservatory. The light is good here. But in the early hours, one day this week, I was listening to the radio. It was either BBC World Service or an American channel. And what they were saying, because so many people are now having to record themselves either for the television and Zoom being so popular, they all want to record themselves with books behind them. So evidently that's a really good backdrop. And there is some firm somewhere that have worked out now where they'll make a screen for you to go behind, so the screen will all be books. And also they'll tailor the books particularly for you or your career or your passion, and so the books will fit in as to what suits you. When I first heard it, I thought somebody was actually sending them a pile of books, but no, they actually make this screen and they tailor it for you. And I just thought, when I listened to that, I thought, well, actually, perhaps I need just to show to people that I do have some real books and I do use them. Well, these are a couple of my bookcases, and I love my books. I inherited most of my books from my father, but I'm also delighted when I get books from other people. Some of the books here, not all of them, but just some of the books here, I know the authors, and so when I look through, I think of that author. Also, on some of the books here, there are people who have bought me a book, and so when I think within the church, when I look at books, I can think of that person. There's a book here I can see Peter Sargent bought me. There's a book here I can see Steve Wolford bought me. There's another book here Barry James bought me. There's another book here David Bentel gave to me. There are some books here that somebody gave me. I think they thought my speaking needed improving, and yes, it does. So they gave me some books to help me with my speaking, as if I didn't have any books, but I was grateful to receive them. And as long as Christ is preached, that is the main thing. I hope in looking at these books, you do not see any books that you have loaned to me and you have not received them back. Please do not loan me a book, but if you want to buy me a book, please do. And if you see any of these books and you'd love to borrow one of these books, because it's one you're dying to read and you've been searching for, the thing to do is to phone a friend, and who knows, that friend may have the book that you're looking for. I'm delighted to have another bookcase full of books, and some of these books, when I look at some, I may have been going through a particular season in my life, or the church may have been going through a challenging season, which meant I was going through a challenging season. And some of these books were very close to me at that time, and a book that I was regularly dipping into. And so you have some precious memories when you begin to look at some of your books. All these books I've not read every book cover to cover. Some of these books you don't read cover to cover. Some of them you just dip into, and they're extremely helpful. These are a wonderful set. It's a biblical illustrator. It's every book in the Bible. And when you look up a text, you've got a commentary from several speakers on that particular text. These books are good. I use these books more 25, 30 years ago to what I use them today, but they're a wonderful set. I've also got a set here by Spurgeon, the New Park Street Pulpit. Again, I tended to use these more 25, 30 years ago, but they're well worth having. Also, I've got a set here by Campbell Morgan that I actually prefer to Spurgeon. I find it easier reading, but they're a wonderful set to have. Also, there's just a few books here by R.T. Kendall, and I found even on my other bookshelves, anything by R.T. Kendall is well worth the read. But these three is Understanding Theology, The Means of Developing a Healthy Church in the 21st Century. And you can pick these up in used condition. You'll get them through Amazon Books, and it's well worth getting the set of 3. Very good reading, very good to have. And then my final set of books that I have at home is a set here. Again, Preacher's Homiletic Commentary, good set to have. But also there are some books here that perhaps I keep a little bit closer at hand. And for instance here, the New Testament by N.T. Wright, also written with Bird. That book is well worth having if you haven't got anything by N.T. Wright. The Way into the Holiest. Coming down here, Chuck Swindoll. I find anything by Chuck Swindoll, it's worth having. It's an easy read. It's got lots of Bible in it, and he applies it. Very good to have some books by Charles Swindoll. Here we are, Martin Lloyd-Jones on the Book of Romans. Good to have. Here's a book. The Pastor by Eugene Peterson. If ever there's a good book. I wish I'd written this book. It's a great book. Oh, here's another book. Firstborn Sons by G.H. Lang. Probably 25 years ago, at least, something like that. There used to be in Monmouth a bookstore. It was the size of a supermarket, and to my understanding, they distributed to Christian bookshops around the country. In this supermarket size of books, I could go there and I could walk and I could select some books. And one day, John Phillips was with me from Lincoln. John was the senior, the older Bible teacher that was in Lincoln. He'd been a vice principal of a Bible college at one time. And so I just walked round with John, and I simply said to John, what book should I buy? And I let John pick the books for me. This was one of the books, Firstborn Sons by G.H. Lang. Again, here's another R.T. Kendall, Sermon on the Mount. Oswald Chambers, My Utmost for His Highest, a set of daily readings, well worth having. Oh, here's another book. Ian Macpherson, The Faith Once Delivered. Ian Macpherson was my mother's pastor and a wonderful speaker. For anybody who does speaking, you will love this book. And some of what he has to say, it's just so good. Tim Keller, The Reason for God. Anything by Tim Keller is worth getting. This is a good book. Again, Eugene Peterson. Oh, here's a book I wish I'd written. The Glory of Christ by Peter Lewis. If you want to do a study on Christ, get this book. Glory of Christ, Peter Lewis. John Phillips told me about that one. Everybody needs an Operation World. I think I've got 3 here, but you need an Operation World. Oh, also, some books that are slightly different. Books that tell somebody's story and see where they started out from very humble beginnings. And so, for instance, this is, and some of these books, they're really books of faith, and when faith has been challenged. And so at times when you're in a challenging situation and there doesn't seem to be a breakthrough, there seems to be a mountain ahead of you, at times to dip into some of these books. Oral Roberts, Expect a Miracle, My Life and Ministry. When I was a child, Oral Roberts came to Newport in South Wales. My father invited him over. My dad booked the rugby stadium Rodney Parade and put a crusade for Wales on. But Oral Roberts, just to dip into his book and to find that he was a pastor, pastoring a church, and got a burden for divine healing. So much so he contacted churches around him in the days when people were not praying for the sick.
and he put a special meeting on in the afternoon and sought God and believed for people to be healed. And Orwell tells the story with some of the national crusades that he put on. He would be in his room waiting upon God before he went to pray for anybody in that meeting. And they'd be knocking on the door saying, it's time to come for the meeting. But he used to wait until he felt something in the palm of his hand, and he would seek God until he felt this in the palm of his hand. Then he knew that healing was going to flow. Well worth a read. And now here's another book. Again, the life of Robert Schuller, and he calls it Goliath. Robert Schuller went on to build the Crystal Cathedral in California, widely known television ministry. But Robert Schuller started out simply pastoring a church, but got the burden to do something bigger. And so on a Sunday afternoon, he hired a drive-in cinema, and after he had finished his morning service, he would bring the car around with a trailer on the back. He'd push the organ out of the church onto the back of the trailer. He would drive to the drive-in cinema where he was putting on an afternoon service, and his wife would go onto the trailer and she'd play the organ for the service. There was a small building nearby. He would stand on the roof of that building to preach the message. And Robert Schuller, you just see some of the challenges. Yes, he's a possibility thinker man. All things are possible. But there are times in life you need just to pick that up and read some of that. It's an encouragement to you. Every Day with Jesus, Selwyn Hughes, Billy Graham, Just As I Am. Now here's an interesting book. It's My Life by Bill Clinton. You may wonder why I've got this on my bookcase. Pearl and I, we were on the Queen Mary. We were on a cruise. And the Queen Mary, it has the biggest library of any cruise ship. I forget the number of books, 10, 12,000 books. So while Pearl can be in the pool, when you go to the library on the Queen Mary, it's right at the front of the ship. I think it's above the bridge. And they've also got 4 or 5 leather seats right at the front in the library, looking out to sea. And so you can go, you can get a book from the library, you can sit in these leather chairs, looking out to sea. It's a wonderful cruise. And whilst on the cruise, I picked up My Life by Bill Clinton. And he goes right through his political career, but he also tells about when he was the governor of Arkansas, that somebody invited him to a camp meeting. There were thousands at this camp meeting. He went there and he writes of the impact on his life when he heard the congregation all singing in other tongues. And I forget the figures, but it might have been for 8-9 year period. I think Bill Clinton only missed those camp meetings just 1 year. And when I read that in that book on that cruise, it made me, when I got home, I wanted to buy the book. So, Faith Delivered, a few books here by George Barna. George Barna, I used to read George Barna perhaps more 20 years ago, but if there were statistics in the American church and developments in the American church, to read George Barna was good. Now, here's a book, Heaven by Randy Alcorn. I'm not into these books where perhaps people have these stories how they died and they went to heaven and they came back to life again. I tend not to read like that. But Randy Alcorn simply applies scripture, and he takes the scriptures that he can find concerning heaven or life after death and writes concerning scripture. This is the best book that I've read on heaven. And here's another book which I wish I'd written. Somebody gave me this book 25 plus years ago, The Making of a Man. The Making of a Man by Richard Exley. Now, this book is out of print, but I think on Amazon Books you may be able to get a used copy. This is a good book. And if I was to speak at a men's meeting this week, I'd have a look at this book before I went. It's got so much encouragement in there. Oh, here's a book. Here's a book. A New Heaven and a New Earth by Archibald Hughes. He was the principal, and there's a foreword by the principal of the Melbourne Bible Institute. So somebody, the president, the emeritus of the Melbourne Bible Institute, just writes the foreword. The book is by Archibald Hughes. This book is full of scripture. And if a book handles the return of Jesus Christ with the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation, this is a wonderful book to have. And some years ago, I was going to Brazil, to Amazonia. I was going with John Phillips. We were going to a pastors' conference in Manaus, when up to 300 pastors would come out of the jungle, some of them taking 28 days to get to that conference, 28 days by river to get back again. The church in Manaus was 50,000 strong. That's just the members. And John and I were going to speak at the conference. John, the senior man, me very much the junior man. And so when I met John at the airport, I kept this book just in my hand luggage. And when I read a book, if there is something that I like on a page, I tend not to underline the page. I fold the page corner over. And if there's something back to back on that page, then I fold it twice. So it means when the book goes on back onto my bookcase, if I want to quickly turn to something that stood out in that book, the pages are marked. Well, before I went to Brazil with John, I don't know how many pages I turned over in this book, almost all of them. But when I sat in the airport with John, and we sat there for a couple of hours waiting for the plane, I'm turning to my first page that I turned over. And I'd say to John, what do you make about this? And I'd read him a few lines. And John would talk to me as if he just studied it that morning. And then a little while later, I turned to the next page. And then I'd say, John, what does it mean, all Israel? Well, what does that actually mean? And John would talk to me as if he just read it that morning. Then in a little later, whilst we're still turning, I was still waiting, I would turn to the next page. And, the resources of the power of the kingdom. John, how do you actually see that? And John would talk to me when we got on the plane and we'd had our meal. After the meal, I get my book out. The flight to Miami, all the way, I'm asking John about this book. We sit in Miami waiting for the evening flight to fly down to Manaus, stopping off at Caracas on the way, and all the way waiting for the plane. And on the plane, I'm turning this for John. And we were away for 2 to 3 weeks. Never once did John say to me, I'll have to look that up for you. Every time he just explained this to me, and it was one of the most wonderful studies. My biggest disappointment was this. I never recorded it. I wish I'd recorded everything he was saying. But this is a good book to read. A New Heaven and a New Earth by Archibald Hughes. What am I reading right now? A friend, Ian Green, has just sent me Checking into Faith. I just started this book. I've got to get a move on with it. Ian has seen it and done it. He's well travelled in ministry, and this is a good book. This is what I'm reading right now. Here's another couple of books. Paul Francis leads Glenwood Church in Cardiff. A little book on soul care. It is a little book, but it's well worth reading, well worth getting. And finally, and I'm a little bit hesitant on recommending books. And I'll say why. Because sometimes people can think, oh, if he just reads that book or just reads this particular author, this must be his leaning in his thinking. This must be his leaning in his theology. Because I've got a book on my bookcase doesn't mean to say I agree with everything in the book. Doesn't mean to say I agree with all the books that author may have written. But usually there's something in that book that's blessed me at some time. And I've got books that actually the authors are from different standpoints, different theological positions, looking perhaps at the same text differently. I just find that helpful. This is a good book. Journey to Significance by Tony Miller. Tony Miller sadly passed away just a couple of weeks ago. But when I was in a challenging season, about 15 years ago, I kept this book by my bedside. And what I did, I would just dip into it every night, just read a paragraph. And in a difficult season, this book helped me get through. And so, Journey to Significance by Tony Miller. It's probably out of print now, but you should get a used copy. Now, these are just some of my books. I know when I'm doing my recordings, I don't have any books behind me. I've got more books that are in my office in Narberth, but I just wanted to show you, just to say, I have some books, they're real books, and it's not just a screen behind me of pretend books. Hey, go and get yourself a book.